Hey everyone, I am back again and I'm venturing into the world of chapter books today with Hidden Figures. This is actually one of my most favorite stories because I studied engineering in college, and as a Black woman engineer, it has a special place in my heart. So I figured I would share it with you all. So let's begin. It is by Margot Lee Shetterly, I believe. Let me check that. Yes, it is. It's by Margot Lee Shetterly. So I'm going to read the prologue and chapter 1 today. Prologue. Growing up in Hampton, Virginia, I assumed the face of science was brown like mine. My dad worked at the Langley Research Center at NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I bet y'all have heard of NASA. It's a pretty big corporation. He started there as an engineering intern in 1964 and retired as an internationally respected climate scientist in 2004. Our next-door neighbor taught physics. Our church pews were crowded with mathematicians. I knew so many African Americans working in science, math, and engineering that I thought that's just what Black folks did. My father, who as a high school student had wanted to study electrical engineering, lived a different story. Become a physical education teacher, my grandfather told him. He thought my dad would have trouble finding work as an engineer. In the 1960s, most college-educated African Americans took teaching jobs or worked for the post office. As late as 1970, just 1% of all American engineers were Black, and my father was one of them. Because of my father's job, I was part of the NASA family. I grew up saving my allowance to buy tickets to ride ponies at the annual NASA Carnival and sharing my Christmas wish list with the Santa at the NASA holiday party. On Thursday nights, I sat with my family and cheered for the Stars, my dad's NBA team. That's the NASA Basketball Association, not the National Basketball Association. My Sunday school teacher worked at NASA as a computer, doing the complex math for the aerospace engineers. And she wasn't an electrical computer like we had. They actually wrote out every single equation and solution by hand, and they were actually computing every answer. She wasn't alone. From the 1940s through the 1970s, hundreds of women, many of whom were Black, worked as mathematicians at NASA. It wasn't until I was older that I appreciated just how extraordinary this occupation was for Black women in the South during the days of segregation. The first 5 women were hired at Langley as computers in 1935, and they were white. 10 years later, so in 1945, there were more than 400 women working as mathematicians, and many of them were Black. The contributions made by these African American women have never been heralded, which means they've never been appreciated or shown to the world for the world to see. But they deserve to be remembered, and not as a side note in someone else's account, but as the center of their own story. These women should be celebrated not just because they are Black or because they are women, but because they are an important part of American history. This is their story. Chapter 1, Setting the Scene. Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden loved math. As children, they showed special skill in arithmetic, and they went on to study mathematics in college. After graduation, they worked as teachers before going to work as computers or mathematicians for the government's Air and Space program. Over the years, hundreds of women worked as mathematicians for this federal agency called the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which researched and promoted the study of flight. But these women were among many who distinguished themselves with their talents and hard work. Dorothy Vaughan was a pioneer. She joined the NACA in 1943, the first year the agency began hiring African American women as computers, and she was the first to be promoted into a management position. She was a role model for other women, and she helped to steer the careers of many talented women who were joining the NACA. I bet that was pretty scary to be the first of Black women, but really just any group of people to go in and do this. Have you guys ever been the first of someone to start something or to be a part of something? It's a really tough challenge, but really cool. Mary Jackson was the first African American woman to move up the ranks and become an engineer at the NACA. She was a fighter, standing up for herself and for other women who deserved the chance to prove themselves. Her work helped to make supersonic aircraft fly higher and faster. Katherine Johnson was an African-American woman who became an essential member of the team that put the first American in orbit around Earth. She was a dreamer and an independent thinker who was unafraid to imagine what others considered to be impossible. She helped do the math that was required to send the first men into space and to bring them home safely, which is a very important part of sending someone into space. Christine Darden was an African-American woman who became one of the world's leading experts on supersonic flight. That means you're going faster than the speed of sound. She became the face of the next generation of female space scientists. Her groundbreaking research on predicting sonic booms is still used today, which is, more than 70 years later. That's wild. The accomplishments of these 4 women were remarkable, but their work was even more impressive because it was achieved while living and working in the South during a time when racial discrimination was commonplace, which means it happened everywhere, and when most women with an interest in math were expected to become math teachers. A different time. In the 1800s, after the Civil War, the government passed laws that ended slavery and granted full citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Later, however, many state and local governments passed other laws that legalized racial segregation. These regulations, which were most common in the South, kept Black people and white people apart in many situations. They could not eat in the same restaurants, they could not drink from the same water fountains, they could not use the same restrooms, they could not attend the same schools, they could not ride in the same parts of buses, they could not live in the same neighborhoods, they could not receive care in the same hospitals, they could not visit the same beaches, they could not compete on the same sports teams, they could not sit in the same sections in movie theaters, they could not marry someone of a different race, they could not even be buried in the same cemeteries. That's a really long list, and I'm sure there were plenty more things that people weren't allowed to do. Technically, African Americans had the right to vote. However, many local laws made it impossible for them to do so. Some communities levied or charged poll taxes or enforced literacy requirements or imposed other restrictions that made it difficult or impossible for Black people to register and vote. And since people who were not registered to vote weren't allowed to serve on juries or run for political office, many African Americans were deprived of these civil rights as well. During the 1930s, the United States experienced the Great Depression, a decade-long period of economic struggle. Have you all heard of the Great Depression? It was a pretty tough and painful time of U.S. history. Jobs became difficult to find and wages decreased dramatically. All Americans suffered, but African Americans faced the most serious challenges in finding work. For many African Americans, World War II was an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families. Black men enlisted in the military in large numbers. Even though they served in separate Black infantry regiments, usually overseen by white officers, they believed that their loyalty and patriotism would help Blacks to earn rights that white citizens had. Women also enlisted in the Army, where they were called WACs, for Women's Army Corps. And they served in all-female units in the Navy too. And for women like Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, World War II opened the door to a career as a professional mathematician. Each of them found their way to the Langley Laboratory, where they met one another, and women like them, smart, brave, confident, and good at math. The war was changing the world, and it would change their lives as well. That was an exciting first bit of this book, and I am really excited to keep reading more with you next time. See you then. Have a great day.